So you often hear me talking about the psychological me, the psychological identity, the doer. All those words or names are interchangeable. So the doer, the psychological me, the psychological identity. Those names, as opposed to what we could call our true self or the real self. And the real self really is that which remains when the psychological identity, the psychological me, subsides, falls away, dissolves. And it can do that, it only does that in an instant, in the moment. Now, when I'm talking about it dissolving, falling away, I'm not necessarily talking about some profound insight or spiritual experience where there is this quite radically different state of knowing oneself or knowing life. That is something that can happen as part of the process, and it's usually more of an indication that something specific along the way is dissolving or changing, rather than what an integrated experience or way of being in life will feel like. So what I just mentioned is a peak experience where, let's say, there is a very profound sense of oneness or witnessing, not being the body, not being a person. That's not what I'm talking about in relation to the falling away of the psychological me or the falling away of the doer. That experience, that state, that shift is more an indication of a specific change that is, you could say, important or significant, that will lead towards a more integrated experience of life, which is, in my experience, returns much more to a human living as a human being, but without the psychological identity, without the psychological me. So what exactly is the psychological me? Well, it's a narrative. It's a movement of thought, but because of the content of the thought, it isn't seen or experienced as thought, but rather translates into the sense of who we are in that moment when it's present. So the dissolving of that is simply the dissolving of a particular type of thinking. And with that dissolving or stopping of a particular type of thinking, there is a change in the flavor of the present moment. And in simple terms, the thinking, in practical terms, the thinking that dissolves is the thinking about the past and the future, but very specific thoughts about the past and the future. It's not that thinking about the past per se is the problem, but rather it's thinking about the past with regret, with blame, with a sense of it shouldn't have been that way. And it's the same with thinking about the future. It isn't thinking about the future per se that is the problem. There is a capacity to think about the future as part of a biological planning process. And that thinking about the future is not part of the psychological me or psychological identity, unless the psychological identity is part of that thinking where there is an attachment to outcomes, which really means that there is this expectation that things should turn out this way, that they turn out this way if I make them happen, and that my completeness and my happiness is dependent on some circumstance in the future. And if that's the thinking, so guilt and blame in relation to the past, expectation and worry in relation to the future. And as part of expectation, we can throw in attachment to outcome, which really means a sense that I need this in order to be complete. And complaining in the present moment. All of that mental movement and narrative, which when we look at it is always an attitude to the flow of life, that is the psychological me. And it's so habituated, it's so automatic, it's so consistent and uninterrupted that that's how we know ourselves. It arises as soon as there is life, as soon as we find ourselves in daily living. That psychological me more or less assumes itself, i.e. is there, and it is continually thinking about the past, thinking about the future, and judging what is happening in the present moment as good enough or not good enough. And that creates a sort of lens through which life is known. It is a filter in a sense, and that filter is inherently uncomfortable. Inherently there is an uncomfortableness with oneself. We could say, because that's not what, we could say that there's an uncomfortableness when that filter is there, because it's not who we truly are. There is an essence of the human being that exists, and it's much more natural, we could say, or much more fundamental or primordial compared to the psychological me that is one step removed from what we really are. And so by default, there is a uncomfortableness. Something doesn't feel right when life is being lived through this psychological me. It is inherently, the psychological me is inherently uncomfortable in life. It can't actually be comfortable in life. Life is, by its very nature, either actual in the moment threat or attack on the psychological self, or it is potentially a threat or attack on the psychological self. So by default, the psychological self is freaked out being in life. And so there is the opposite of harmony, there is the opposite of flow, there is an entity on alert that is essentially struggling and fighting through life, carrying a load and basically fighting up, pushing through circumstance that it imagines is not right the way it is. And so it's more or less in resistance. And that resistance gets tiring and feels uncomfortable. Not physically uncomfortable, but an uncomfortableness that is the opposite, or rather, let's call it the opposite of peace of mind. And when peace of mind sets in, that's for the first time when we can realize from our own experience, actually, this peace of mind is what I was always looking for, but didn't have any clue that that's what I was looking for, and therefore wasn't really looking for it. Was looking for something else, thinking that we were really after something else, and the something else is outcomes, which is what the psychological me believes it needs. So it is seeking for outcomes in the future, looking back at the past, feeling regret for how things turned out. And it's only when life, reconfigures the human being such that that psychological me falls away, that there is this sense of relief. It's like, what a relief. I don't have to engage in life in the same way that was happening before. And primarily that's because we come to know ourselves differently. We come to know life differently. The objective changes. The purpose of life changes. It changes with the identity. When the identity changes, essentially the false sense of self dissolves or crumbles. The objective of the false sense of self crumbles with it. And the functioning of the false sense of self, which is a functioning that in practice feels uncomfortable, falls away with it. And that's when we realize, this is what is really available, that sustains us, that is something that we understand can be continuous and unbroken. We come to see that it's continuous and unbroken, or capable of being continuous and unbroken, because it isn't a feeling that is a result of what is happening in life. We come to know this because as it sets in, it's there irrespective of what happens over a course of, say, a week, a month, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years. And as the time goes on, inevitably there are going to be a whole range of events and circumstances. Even within the space of a day, there are going to be a whole range of events and circumstances. And over an extended period of time, you get a much broader range of the potential of life. Unfortunately, people that we love will die. We will get sick. We'll get better. We will have financial wins and financial losses. We will have relationship breakdowns and relationship successes, and good times and bad times, challenges of all sorts. Weather won't be good sometimes, it will be good other times. Cars will break down, we'll have accidents, we'll win prizes, we'll be successful in projects, we'll be unsuccessful in projects. All sorts of pleasures and pains, which is really the fluctuation of the flow of life. It's a set of outcomes, one after another after another. And sometimes the outcome is going to be in line with our preferences, what it is that feels pleasurable to the body. And so obviously that is pleasure. And sometimes it's not what feels good for the body, and so that's pain. And the pleasure and pain can be essentially broken down into physical pleasure or pain, or sensational pleasure or pain. So nice music fits under the category of sensational pleasure or pain. If you stub your toe, that's sensational, or let's call it physical pleasure or pain. Then you have emotional pleasure or pain, which is different to the psychological suffering. It is part of the flow of life, and so if someone shouts at you, it isn't a sensational pleasure or pain. It's not the same as burning your hand with hot water, or stubbing your toe, or having a nice strawberry. All of that is sensational pleasure or pain. If someone's shouting at you, that can be received as emotional pain. It's not what you would prefer. Now, that emotional pain, someone shouting at you, when the psychological me is in place, all pleasures and pains will tend to be taken very personally, and there'll be this extra layer of suffering. So if I talk about someone shouting at you and telling you that you haven't done a good job at something, and I call it emotional pain, automatically a lot of people are going to assume that is the uncomfortableness that we feel with ourselves, maybe a sense of shame or a sense of hatred towards the other for telling us we haven't done a good job. That's not the emotional pleasure or pain that I'm talking about. That would fit into the category of the uncomfortableness, which is the reaction of the psychological self to the pleasure or pain that is being delivered. So the emotional pleasure or pain is before the psychological self grabs hold of it, and it's what we could call biological, and it's biological because the body has its biological makeup and its psychological makeup. And the biological makeup includes all of the body structure, which includes emotions. So when the psychological self falls away, the human being remains and is still capable of feeling emotion, still capable of feeling love and compassion, irritation or anger. And so emotion doesn't fall away when the psychological self falls away. So hopefully it's clear that emotion is part of the biological functioning of the human being. And then, as with all pleasure or pain, the psychological self, which is this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, loves to grab hold of emotional pain and make it very personal and say, oh, you shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have done this. So at this stage, we're just defining the different sorts of pleasures and pains that are available in life. And another one that's thrown in within this framework is financial pleasure and pain. Actually, I haven't ever said it. I'll use the opportunity here now that we're talking about financial pleasure or pain. Thank you for everyone that's contributed over the course of the last 3 months in terms of some donations. They're very appreciated. I've intended to say this thank you genuinely to people several times, many times, and it's never seemed appropriate. And in this case, talking about financial pleasure, when a donation comes in and my phone beeps and it's, someone has sent in a thank you, either by email or accompanied with a donation, well, that's financial pleasure. And sometimes I have people that will put in a recurring payment donation. So that's, oh my God, that's financial pleasure. And on occasion that recurring payment gets cancelled. So they must have decided that the teaching didn't resonate after all, or their financial situation might have changed or whatever. And so when that gets cancelled, very understandable, but it's an example of financial pain, where instead of receiving financial pleasure, that is brought to an end. So anyway, that was my opportunity to say thank you very much for everyone who contributes via a donation for the satsangs and the other teachings that are delivered. So going back to the flow of life, it's sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Now, the peace of mind that turns out to be available, and once we start finding this space inside of us, this shift away from the psychological me thinking that covers up the peace of mind, we find that there is something very simple, and it's self-confirming, because that's when we know, this is what I was looking for. And it's not all what psychological me imagines could be fulfilling. Primarily because the psychological me has no idea about how to be fulfilled. So it thinks, the psychological me is designed to think, I will be fulfilled one day when I get pleasure, 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 pleasure in life. So it feels defined by pleasure or pain. And that's what attachment to pleasure is. And then there is aversion to pain. A psychological aversion to pain. This shouldn't have happened. Why did you do this? Why did I do that? I hate myself. I hate you. All of that. And even when it gets the pleasure, because you won't find happiness in pleasure, you will find pleasure in pleasure. And so pleasure is not to be pushed away or shunned. However, if we turn it into the source of our happiness, we're overrating, or we're relating to pleasure in a way that doesn't serve us. And so the peace of mind is when that attitude of the doership and attachment falls away and stops. And it falls away and stops when it becomes understood by the working mind. So let's introduce the notion of the thinking mind and the working mind. The thinking mind is the name given to the type of thinking that I'm describing here as the psychological identity, the me, the doer. So whenever the narrative of the past and the future and feeling guilt and shame, blame, complaint and expectation and worry, when any of that narrative is going, that is coming from the conditioning of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which really means the deeply ingrained misinterpretation of how life unfolds, what the mechanics of life unfolding are, and the false idea of where my completeness, where my happiness is to be found. And so when that's in place, it's always triggered by just being in life, and that's the thinking mind. The working mind, on the other hand, is the part of the human functioning that is capable of speaking and thinking, calculating things, deciding what of the various options might give the best result, figuring out what time to call a taxi to get to the airport on time. That type of thinking is functional thinking, and it doesn't include in it attachment to outcome or doership. Now, what often happens is we have the functional thinking, and then the doership and attachment jumps in, so we can be thinking about a problem and a solution to the problem, and then the attachment to outcome comes in. Once the outcome is visualized or imagined or thought about, then the doership jumps in and go, oh yes, if that happens, that will be very good. So now let me make sure that I put in place a plan that is going to make it happen of my own volition. Whereas if it's just a functional mind, we'll have the problem, we'll think of a solution, there will be the understanding that yes, that solution would be my preference, but I'm not in control of that happening. My happiness isn't dependent on that. I will think about what I think is the best approach, understanding that all of this thinking is the functioning of the human being at that point in time, its genes and up-to-date conditioning, that the way that it will solve the problem may be good and may not be good. And so if that's how we approach our thinking and the potential outcomes, then that's the opposite of the jumping in of the psychological me that takes what the working mind has decided and then creates attachment and doership around it. So sometimes it's evident in speaking with people, even after hearing about this non-doership and non-attachment, some piece of the puzzle is missing, because the penny doesn't really drop as to what is being spoken about. So there isn't a separation in a sense. There isn't a capacity for the seeker to step back out of the doership thinking. And that's not surprising, because what can happen is that the concepts that are being put forward in the teaching, and all teachings are a set of concepts, they're not the truth. Anything that has been written down in the past or in the future, or said in the past or the future by anyone, is a concept, it's a description, it's a pointer, and it's not the truth. the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. And that's a feeling, that's a sense, that's something that is prior to any concept. And that's where hopefully we can drop into a place outside of thinking and concepts. However, in order to drop into that place, ironically, sometimes the difference between the two ways of being, or one way of being and the other way of thinking, needs to be described conceptually. And the concepts hopefully are saying, at any point, just stop and be. And it can easily be that the seeker that is hearing the concept is hearing it from a doership point of view. And even though it's the concepts, the descriptions are talking about a stopping, then it can sound like, okay, I have to stop. I have to do the stopping. And the I that hears that is the I that doesn't know how to freeze. The I that hears it doesn't know how to freeze. It knows how to try and do something, try and gain a result through its efforts. And that's half the problem, is that, we're so convinced, this doer is convinced that life is happening because it does things. And so it doesn't, it's like a hamster on a hamster wheel. And so if you tell the hamster, you have to get to a place where you just stop. So the hamster says, okay, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to get there. And the whole point is stop. And the hamster says, yes, I'm working hard at stopping. And in fact, so the hamster assumes that even stopping is something it needs to do by, going for it on the hamster wheel. And it's only when we realize, it's a bit like, trying to keep, it's a bit like if you've been tasked with keeping a space quiet. There's lots of people and you've been tasked with keeping the place quiet. And so someone starts talking and you go up and say, listen, this is meant to be a quiet place. And if you keep doing your job, which is keeping the place quiet, and yet you're not quiet yourself, you are essentially not the solution, but the problem to some extent. And if there's only you and different versions of you, then all the noise is because of you. And so the only way that silence happens is when you realize your task of keeping the place quiet requires you to withdraw. So the psychological identity is contained within the narrative. So the uncomfortable me doesn't exist as a fundamental essence of the human being. it comes into existence with a certain function, a certain mentation, which is the attitude to what is happening and what has happened and what will happen. And because that attitude is a given, in a way, it's in place, and so it's always functioning, then the psychological me essentially is consistently there, and so we know ourselves as that. And it can be a surprise to us that that self only exists in a narrative. And in the narrative, it feels like there is me and the me that is feeling this and that and reflecting on the past and the future. And what I'm trying to point at here is there isn't a me and the thinking. There is thinking, and the thinking includes embedded in it the idea of the person, the psychological person. Because even when the psychological person falls away, in the way I speak about it, there is still a person, there is still a human being, but a human being without the psychological person. And the suffering is all to do with the psychological person. And if it gets seen that when you are feeling fear, for example, or anxiety, or insecurity, or blame, shame, resentment, the one that is feeling resentment exists in the narrative of resentment. And so when that becomes recognized, that there is no sufferer except as contained in the narrative of suffering, then that might be when an aspect of the human being steps back and either witnesses the suffering but feels, oh, I'm not that. Or a stepping back happens, and simultaneous to the stepping back, the suffering dissolves. And what might happen is, especially at the beginning, we can step out of it, out of the suffering, only when it really has become seen that there is no sufferer except as contained in the suffering thinking, the resentment, the blame, the shame, the expectation. And so in each moment, any moment, there can be a stopping and becoming present with what is right here now, like becoming present with the physical objects. I wouldn't suggest being present with just a singular object, but rather try and be present with the entirety of the visual field and auditory field, where everything is allowed to be contained in the space of awareness, which really means a lack of focusing on objects, and practice regularly opening up your gaze so that it becomes apparent that at any time the whole vista of life, the whole experience of life arises within your awareness. And so instead of focusing on a book and the word, the title of the book, for example, allow all sorts of objects to be there and bring attention to here. And what happens is the psychological narrative about the past can't sustain itself when your interest is in the present. What we might find is that the system, including the psychological me, is saying, look, don't waste your time on being present with what is, because frankly, that's always going to be there. It's not so important. What's really important is that you fully focus on being resentful, because that's beneficial. And so we get dragged back into being resentful because the system is prioritizing that. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should stop prioritizing that. You can't. That is a result of what has been ingrained. So if you see an insistence in suffering such that it can't be stopped, then understand that's just a movement based on how everything has been positioned, how all the values and the identity has been positioned. And how that changes is to simply become aware of something as simple as that narrative is uncomfortableness. That narrative is our unhappiness. So if you want to know what unhappiness is, the suggestion is when you know you're not happy at a particular point in time, you can say, okay, in this moment, I'm not happy. And then look at what is happening. And invariably, you'll find that there is an attitude towards the past or the present or the future that is an attitude of personal doership or attachment to outcome. So personal doership is the attitude where we believe I am a separate, independent entity that has complete, full control over everything that I think, say, feel, and do. Basically believing that I am an autonomous central unit that is unaffected and uninfluenced by anything other than this imaginary me that is believed to be completely insular. Why I say insular is because if it isn't seen as insular, then it must be dependent, it must be interconnected, it must be influenced, it must be shaped. And the belief in personal doership doesn't hold any of those ideas about itself. It says, no, I am autonomous. I am my own agent. Unaffected by anything else, and all of the decisions I make, all of the thoughts I have, all of the feelings that I have, all of the actions that happen through me, they are all the responsibility of this me that has to be imagined, because I laugh at how polar opposite our idea of ourself can be from what becomes evident when we have a closer look. So this notion that we have that I am insular and autonomous is an imagination, because that entity does not exist. So when it is believed that that's what we are, that has to be imagination. It has to be a figment. It has to be an error, an assumption, a belief, but one that is not accurate. Because what we do find when we look is the instrument that is speaking, that feels things, that responds to on all sorts of levels. Basically, the instrument that functions. Thinking is a biological and psychological, but essentially an output of the body-mind organism. Everything that we know as part of our human experience is the result of a body-mind organism. The body-mind organism is essentially a biological machine, a biological robot that thinks, that feels, So by saying it's a biological robot, we're not diminishing the experience of life. We're explaining the experience of life. So that this biological robot feels love, it feels compassion, it feels irritation and anger, it thinks, it has sensations, or it is aware of sensations and aware of its own sense of self. So calling it a biological instrument shouldn't be assumed to be some form of diminishment of life. Otherwise, if that's the case, then it's not going to make sense that we're a biological instrument. What do you mean? If we assume that means that there won't be any, if we assume that that means that there's no capacity to love or to feel. So biological instruments is just the new explanation of the full range, the full depth of human experience. It's an explanation that, to me, has always been the way things function. It's readily available for observation. It doesn't require a very complex assessment of how things work for us to conclude, yes, if someone plays around with your brain, if nature plays around with the brain by producing too much cholesterol or something like that in the arteries, and then you have a stroke, that stroke damages the machine, and then the machine functions differently. So there might be problems cognizing things that we could cognize before. There might be problems moving, speaking, all sorts of changes to the functioning. And if there is trauma to the body-mind organism, brain damage, then we see that things, the outputs are not the same. And so it should be very clear that the outputs of the human being are correlated to the design and structure of the body-mind organism. So the concept is saying everything that fits into the category of biological or psychological functioning is an output of the body-mind organism. And what is the body-mind organism in this moment? How can we explain the body-mind organism? And in general terms, it can be broken down to a very simple concept. And that is that the body-mind organism in this moment is a result of our genes and our up-to-date conditioning. And we didn't pick our genetic structure, the blueprint that gets put in place when the sperm and the egg come together, and then that blueprint on its own grows, following the blueprint. And the growing doesn't happen independent of the environment. It happens within an environment and is affected to the extent that the environment interacts with the biological organism. So at this very moment, Roger's configuration is a result of everything that came before in the universe, and the same for all of your configurations. The same for this moment in life, we could say, is a result of everything that came before. 13.8 billion years ago is where it all started. And if we want to break it down into a more manageable set of variables, we can say that Roger in this moment is a result of the specific genetic blueprint that got put in place and how that genetic blueprint interacted with the ever-changing flow of life that the body-mind organism found itself in from the moment of conception up to this point in time. And that interaction with life is what we can call new conditioning in each moment. And what's most significant to look at is the conditioning that comes from parents, society, friends, the religious doctrine or structure, the political structure, the school that you went to. Those influences are what are most useful to look at in terms of the up-to-date conditioning that affects the genetic structure. And so the genes and up-to-date conditioning, so the up-to-date conditioning is the result of all of the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning in each moment. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning are what we are in this very moment. And in the next moment it changes. So I've just described genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is just new conditioning, which to some extent has changed your up-to-date conditioning. For some people, in this moment, it might have been, wow, I've never thought about myself as a biological instrument designed by life, not by me. I am a result of all of these factors I had no control over. And here I am going through life assuming that I am the one in control of whatever happens through this body-mind organism. So someone might have heard it and gone, that's amazing. That's new conditioning that radically has the potential to radically change your up-to-date conditioning. Someone else might be hearing this new conditioning, but at the same time thinking about, what they're going to have for dinner and what they need to buy from the shops. And the new conditioning maybe doesn't have any really significant effect on their up-to-date conditioning. So we're not in control of what new conditioning is delivered. Your computer might suddenly freeze, and so no more new conditioning of coming from me. There'll be still new conditioning from the rest of your environment. But whether your computer freezes is not in your control. What comes out of my mouth is not in your control. Frankly, it's not in my control either. And how it is received by myself, or if I was listening, by you, is not in your control either. So we find that I had no control over my genes or up-to-date conditioning. I had no control over my genes, and I had no control over which country I was born into, which parents I was born to, which school I went to, which friends I made. And all of that is a result of who you are in this moment. And if we start seeing this, like intellectually understanding it, but then really looking at the body and understanding that, if you have a finger that didn't quite grow the way it was meant to grow, that's a result of your genetic blueprint and or the environment that genetic blueprint grew up in. And if you have the nicest, the most attractive hands, that's a result of your genetic blueprint and the up-to-date conditioning that accompanied the genetic blueprint as it was growing. And so if the concepts get applied on the level of your own life experience, and really let's look at what they're talking about. So if you find that you're very argumentative or very defensive, understand that is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so if you start seeing your argumentativeness or your shyness or whatever, your exuberance, and maybe you have a stutter, that is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the concept is pointing to those things, for you to see them for yourself and essentially label them in a way that means not really for the sake of labeling them, but for the sake of seeing the thing itself. The concept is just a description for you to see. And as you see it, if you look back on the past and you think about a speech that you gave that didn't go very well, and you realize that it didn't go well because you made it about you, and speeches about you tend not to go very well. And in hindsight, you see that and you feel embarrassed. And if you're fortunate, you'll say, that couldn't have been helped at that point in time. I didn't realize I didn't realize I didn't have training as to, how to put together a speech. And unfortunately, I, prioritized the wrong things. And that's what happened. And so the outcome may not have been good. There's no point sugarcoating things. What's important is to see that happened not because of this psychological, there is no psychological me that is in control and should have done better. There is a human being that could only function the way it has been programmed and shaped to function. And it did. It did that. So if life is seen that way, it becomes much less personal. It becomes apparent that life is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. And then it's not taken personally. And if it's not taken personally, these things can be let go of. If it's taken personally, they don't get let go of. It seems like it would be irresponsible to let go of it. We believe, no, I have to keep thinking about it. I have to keep feeling bad about it because somehow that's beneficial. And it's the opposite. It's just interfering with the peace of mind that is available if life reconditions us, reshapes us, such that thinking starts to fall away. So let's just focus a little bit more on the fact that the me is contained in the narrative. So if there is blame towards someone that did something in the past that hurt you, understand that the one that is suffering, the one that is blaming, is contained in the narrative. As soon as a stopping happens, what you'll find is the self with a capital S, the true essence, the human being free of the psychological me. There is no suffering except when it is present as the narrative. And within the narrative, there is the one who was hard done by, the one that remembers it. And this is true for all of the different forms of doership and attachment to outcome, which are the forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. The doer, the personal doer, the belief in personal doership, sees myself as the doer, meaning myself as the one in control of how I think and how I act. Therefore sees the other as the personal doer, an autonomous entity in control of what they say, feel, and do. So when the other functions in a way that delivers pain, we hate them for what they did. That is an attack on our completeness. We hate them as the one that should have and could have done differently. As that dissolves, we start to see life is a story unfolding, and the story of my life can be seen as my destiny. and to understand that my destiny will continue until such time as the body dies, and how the body dies and where it dies is part of our destiny. We could say the end of our destiny in this life. Not suggesting there is another life. Let's just worry about happiness in this life. That's what we're really looking for. And as that becomes seen, life is destiny. Life is a predetermined story unfolding. Then when the other delivers pain, it's understood that it was my destiny for there to be pain in that moment, and they were the instrument through which my destiny was being delivered. And at another moment, pleasure will be there, and it is your destiny to have pleasure, and your pleasure may be delivered through the actions of the other. And so it goes. This way, we're all seen as brothers and sisters in the story of life, and the resentment, the hatred, the competition, the rivalry, the suspicion can all fall away, because you know that life is unfolding one way, the way it's destined to unfold, and the other is not capable of taking away your happiness. At worst, the other is capable of delivering pain. To the extent that there is a remembering to drop into the present moment, the pain doesn't get turned into suffering. And then there is no one who suffers. So returning home, returning to your center, is the letting go of the narrative of this is how life should have been, it shouldn't be this way, you shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have done this, I should have been better. I wonder what's going to happen in the future. I'm worried about what's going to happen in the future. I need things to turn out pleasure like this in order to be complete. Returning home is returning to the absence of the psychological narrative, absence of the psychological me. And that's what's referred to as stillness or silence. It's a stillness, silence of the psychological mind. So I think we'll take some questions. Hello, Marianne.
Hi, Rogers. Nice to speak with you, and thank you so much again for these teachings. What you said today really, I was reading Ramesh's book. I think Who Cares? And he mentioned, and something is mentioned that I think you're touching on with the personal doership about cause and effect. So, a student asked, but freedom, responsibility, Ramesh said, freedom from responsibility does not mean freedom from consequences. And the student said, yes, but they are not connected, are they? And Ramesh responds, they are not connected. You see, there is freedom from responsibility. Responsibility refers to the person. Consequences are just happening, or which you have no control. And I guess when this thing gets deeper for me about I'm not the doer, there's something that comes in and says, yeah, but there are consequences. And I guess I guess I'm stuck on the predictability of those consequences.
Well, even so what's being pointed at is there's someone might use the notion that oh, well, I'm not the doer, and think that it absolves them of consequences, as though, if it's used as a psychological excuse, oh, I'm told that everything is predetermined, I'm not the doer, and therefore there's no reason to feel guilt or shame. So, great, let me use this concept as my excuse to carry on the functioning of the psychological me that is attached to outcomes that may be driving someone to steal or to take advantage of people or such things. And so if that notion is heard by that psychological me and it's interpreted as this is my free card, my free card to do whatever I want, what would be pointed out is, well, the truth is that life is unfolding according to, let's say, God's will, which really means God or life put in place everyone's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so everyone is functioning according to not their will, but a greater will. And I don't mean a personal cognitive will, but rather the God's will or life's will is referring to a grand mechanics of what propels us to move forward in life. So we say that's the truth of the matter, but included in those mechanics are consequences. So if you tell the judge that, you're not the doer, it's not going to prevent you from going to prison, let's say, or getting a fine or whatever the consequence is. So you're not personally responsible, however, you are going to be accountable to society. And so that's pretty important to keep in mind. When it comes to consequences, in terms of consequence of outcomes, so you make a decision to, let's say, not go to work and call in sick, that's an option, it's available to you, and there are going to be consequences. Your boss might say, look, you just unfortunately are not a reliable enough worker, and so I think you should find another job. The doer isn't a mechanism to solve the problem of consequences. The consequence is going to be there and be out of our control, even when the belief in personal doership falls away. The belief in personal doership is just simply an attitude that says, I functioned that way because of me, and the me is an idea. When that idea falls away, we'll still function the same way. It's just that our attitude will say, oh, I function that way, not because of me, but because of life. And not as an excuse, just as an understanding. Because it's not used as an excuse, because I know that saying that doesn't absolve me from consequence. So if we're afraid of letting go of doership because there are consequences, that means that we assume that the doer is somehow controlling consequences, which is absolutely not the case. That's the whole point of non-doership, is that the doer believes it is controlling consequences, whereas consequences are just happening.
Yeah. I mean, when you said it like that, it just came home to me that, my belief in doership has so many layers, and it's like I take one away and then there's another one there, and then I see, oh yeah, it's just an attitude. Nothing else changes. And I really heard that this time. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And don't feel you're not alone. There's always layers and layers. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's great when you see what you've just seen. That's actually the falling away of layers. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Marianne. Hi, John.
Hey, Roger. It's nice to see you. Thank you so much for the satsang.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It's just had a quick question about what you were speaking yesterday as well, and you touched on a little bit today. This concept that I am not the doer essentially is a concept, right? And you also happened to mention that Ramesh as well as Ramana said that you use a concept to remove another concept, like a thorn, being used to remove another thorn, and then you drop the two. I was wondering, if you could maybe clarify that a little bit more for myself. Like, for me, I am not the doer is a concept that is intellectually understood at a deep level, let's say, because I see that every action or event that happened in my life was the result of a lot of things that happened prior to it. It wasn't just one single action that led to it. So essentially what I'm seeing is, for every event to take place, there are innumerable number of causes, which by default negates the fact that I had anything to do with it. Slowly I'm getting to the realization that whatever happened so far could not have happened any other way, like even for myself and even the actions of others. And sometimes I just laugh to myself, like even thinking about this. But now the next thing is, if this is again a concept, is Ramesh or yourself, are you telling that this also needs to drop away at some point? Or that's, I guess I'm struggling with that.
Yeah. Well, the freedom doesn't come from the concept, from holding the concept, you are not the doer. If we think that the freedom comes from holding the concept we're not the doer, then what happens is that becomes essentially a new belief, which means it becomes the new identity. We go from being the doer identity to the non-doer identity. And freedom comes from the collapse of identity. And so the question then might be, oh, in that case, how does one let go of the concept that I am not the doer? And if that's what the aim is, what's the point of introducing the concept in the first place? Because if you didn't introduce it, then I wouldn't need to let go of it. And the explanation is that what happens is, what the real problem is the I am the doer belief that has been inserted and ingrained by life. So that exists. The I am not the doer concept is really there just to attack the I am the doer concept, and not to replace it with I am not the doer. So an example of this can be that or an example of how that might function is that if we intellectually understand what the concept is pointing at, and then we start seeing the mechanics of life, because it has been described, because the concepts have described it, we see the mechanics of life differently. And as we see the mechanics of life, we realize that the doership concept is running counter to what we are starting to see.
Yes.
So essentially that means that seeing life and the functioning of life, the impersonal functioning of life, doesn't support the narrative of doership. Because essentially doership doesn't recognize the impersonal functioning of life. It says, I am the one making life this way. So that investigation, the deepening of the intellectual understanding, becomes useful when it essentially nullifies the doership narrative. And it nullifies it when we see the narrative and see what it implies, like, you shouldn't have done this. And we see that blame, you shouldn't have done that, that is extended horizontally. And I'm not talking about saying it to someone. I'm talking about where you're at home or at work for weeks, thinking about how they shouldn't have done it and how you have to, rectify this with them. You have to address it. It's very important. You have to maybe get revenge and whatever. That's a horizontal narrative that is saying you, as a separate independent entity of your own volition, separate from anything else in life, functioned incorrectly. And I think you should have functioned differently. And I'm going to get revenge for you, against you, for having functioned incorrectly. That's what the narrative of doership is saying. So as we start to see that myself with my shortcomings and my good points, the other with their shortcomings and their good points, the circumstances that unfolded that inspired certain movements, because clearly, if, let's say, someone stole your wallet, if your wallet wasn't on the table, they wouldn't have stolen it. And so the fact that it was on the table was part and parcel of their stealing it.
True.
And so as we see that there's a whole lot of factors that make all of this happen, the narrative that I just described doesn't make sense anymore. And so it gets cut off. And when it gets cut off, the ideal place is to be in silence. We don't need there to be a narrative that continues to talk, continues to fill the space with non-doership concepts. The non-doership concepts are really there to cut off the doership concept and nothing more. And so once it has done that, acted as like a samurai sword on the doership narrative, it falls away. If our system understands that this is how the understanding is meant to manifest, rather than it becoming a new narrative. What we find is that when suffering is not there, the notion of non-doership isn't needed. And so for a while the belief in doership is being undone by cutting off narrative that would have gone on for longer periods of time, as the understanding goes deeper, it starts cutting off the narrative quicker and quicker and quicker, which essentially is starving the identity. It's like withdrawing its food, until eventually it stops. And then the concept of non-doership isn't needed. So from that point, you are neither the doer or the non-doer, which hopefully becomes clear that then you just are, and you're just functioning. And you don't need any concept of I'm not the doer. There is just functioning, and who cares whether the doer or not the doer? We care to introduce the notion of non-doership when we are suffering a lot. Then it's relevant to have the notion of non-doership. But once that's dealt with, you can stick the concepts on the fire, because they've done their job.
Sure. Excellent. Yeah, it's just so tricky. I just realized that after the understanding happens, I'm still asking what next, I guess, like once the concept drops away. And I just didn't realize that until I spoke to you, I guess. There's nothing else needs to be said, I guess. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This concept of who cares is very powerful, as I've mentioned, and the comment that was just made reminds me of a comment that was made in a chat I was having today, where the person saw exactly that. It's like they described that a few days ago when I was putting forward one of the models that suggests that our consciousness, our sense of existence, the I amness, may in fact come from a source that we assume is the most unlikely of sources. So, in spiritual teachings of non-duality, usually the source of our awareness is said to be God, universal mind, or all there is, some metaphysical or God. And it may be that all of this is a result of computation, very, very fast computation that actually creates what we are aware of, including our sense of self. Now, I know that a lot of people would disagree with that being a possibility, and I'm very happy for someone to have that opinion. I, however, think it's a possibility. Now, the person I was speaking to today said when she heard that, she felt a sadness. It's like, no, I don't want it to be like that. And she then realized that the who cares is so powerful, because that's just an explanation of a model that may be where all of this comes from. One of many different models that might explain this. And what the model is irrelevant. What we do know is the output, the result, this. And so she saw that you can get caught up in a narrative that says, oh no, I don't want it to be that. And if we can go past the narrative and say, who cares? Who cares what the model is? This is what's important. I am. Then that brings us back out of the suffering. And so, as was just mentioned, if we ask, so what shall I do? Who is asking that question? That's part of the who cares. Like, who cares about what model it is? Who cares what the source of our experience is? The fact is that there is a human experience with all of its depth and an appreciation of the sense of I am. And even if that sense of I am is not as real as we might think, who cares? Because it's still manifesting this way. We get to experience it and appreciate it, and it's more than enough. And so we ask, who, question mark, cares? As in, who is the entity that is caring? We'll find that that entity is contained within the narrative, and that when we realize, actually, who cares about what the future is going to be? Because our narrative might be about, oh, I wonder what's going to happen in the future. I hope that, and we ask the question, who cares about the future? And the answer is, the attachment to outcome, the psychological me. And if there's a dropping out of that into presence, then we know actually who cares about the future. As in, not now, it's not who question mark cares, but, oh, well, who cares? Like, I don't care. As in, not I don't care because I'm uncaring, but rather we rest in our own being and it's not important anymore. Hello, Gregor.
Hello, Roger. Do you hear me? Yes, you do.
I do.
As you mentioned the hamster in the wheel today, I have to admit that it's exactly how I feel often. And you say, if you say stop, and you say it quite often in the satsangs I'm following, it's always something I struggle with because I ask myself how who can stop. So I'm still struggling with it, and I'm just want to share this and ask if you could talk more about this stopping or dropping into now or into being. Yes.
Yeah. So these words, when I say, drop into being, drop into, or stop, they sound like prescriptions. They
Yeah.
sound like I'm telling someone to do something. And so your question is pertinent because it allows me to reiterate, which I do from time to time, that nothing that is said is a prescription of something for you to do, but rather a description of what might happen. So even if it sounds like a prescription, drop into being or stop or rest in awareness or abide in I am, all of these things sound like, oh, someone has to do it. But what what we might find is that when the doer stops trying to do everything, maybe because it gets frustrated, let's say, and it says, oh, look, I've had enough of this seeking business. It doesn't get me anywhere. I'm just going to get on with life. That's actually good if that happens, because now it's stop. There's a stopping of seeking, and so there's no more trying to stop, right? Because you said, enough of this. I'm just going to get on with life. So the doer that is trying to stop is inactivated because you've moved on to a different project. And what might happen in the absence of the doer that is trying to stop, which is the opposite of stopping, that is
I
more,
understand that.
yeah.
Yeah.
What might happen is that a, a stopping might happen without someone actually doing it or trying to do it. And then if that does happen, that's when we realize, you see, it was always a description of what might happen and not a prescription of something that I have to do. And once that movement of stopping becomes familiar, and it's hard because we're so used to moving outwards, and this is a movement in the opposite direction. It's counterintuitive, but once it's like a secret switch or something, and it seems like you have to push, you push really hard, and it doesn't matter how hard you push, the switch doesn't flick, or the lever doesn't flick. And then you realize, oh, I have to move it sideways. And if you move it sideways, it moves so easily and it opens, moves this whole bridge that weighs thousands of tons, let's say. And here we are trying to move it forward all the time. Because I'm just putting forward a visualization that is not this obvious, because it's not this obvious at all. In the example, it's almost like it's impossible. It seems like it's the only way to make it move would be to push it forward, which is not the answer. And it's only when we realize you can move it sideways that it's just so easy then. But until that happens, it's not known to be available. And the stopping is like that. The stopping is it's a withdrawal, and even the withdrawing is not a doing. So it's like, oh, I've had enough of this. That's stopping. That is stopping without you even intending to stop, because you've actually stopped trying to stop.
Funny that you say that, because that's exactly what I thought in the last days. That maybe I just have to relax with it, with all this, and stopping the effort, which is difficult because it's an action too. But I understand what you mean. I have to think about it or contemplate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, I think when we find, we can find ourselves engaging in seeking to a point where it does get too much, and we do realize that it's turned into an objective and something we're trying to do. And taking a break can be amazing. It might seem like, oh no, I've got it all wrong, and I just need to take a break. But the truth is, a lot would have been absorbed in that time, even though the final or the correct movement didn't happen. And in fact, we found ourselves going in what seems like the wrong direction, to the point where we say, oh, I have to take a break. But a lot would have been absorbed in that time. And then in the new space where we are not putting in the effort, let's say, you'd be surprised that how that space allows a lot of what came before to sink in and to start functioning much more effortlessly.